Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Bruce Furtman. Well, Bruce is one of the top Alexander Technique teachers in the world. I highly rate him as an expert on touch and movement. He trained with someone called Marjorie Barstow, who I believe is Bristow, who I believe is one of the sort of top teachers of Alexander Technique of modern times. Also, all sorts of other movement disciplines from dance to martial arts. He founded the Alexander Alliance International. Works with the German branch of that now. He's the author of a book, all kinds of psychological training, joining us from Japan today. So Bruce, welcome.
Thank you.
How did you get interested in the body?
If I start all the way back, I think it was because I had problems with it. When I was a kid, I think I would have been labeled back then as an ADHD kid. Fortunately, that label didn't exist then, so my mother just said I was a boy with a lot of energy. But I sensed that in very basic ways, I was not good at controlling my energy. I had trouble sitting still. I got angry at things. I had speech impediments, and it became a kind of riddle. A problem I had to deal with and a riddle I had to solve, which is how do I regulate my formidable energy as a kid? I made a lot of progress when I was 11, and I started swimming and diving, and then when I was 12 and I started gymnastics, and I would work out 4 or 5 hours a day after school. When I came back to school the next morning, I had about a normal amount of energy. I could sit in a class. And so I needed to move a lot. So that was, if I had to say, the very beginning of what got me interested or why I needed to look at it, it would have been that. That's the beginning.
Well, I can relate to that. And so I know you're not a straight down the line Alexander Technique teacher, but you are the first Alexander Technique teacher we've had on the show. So what is the Alexander Technique and how did you get interested in it?
Well, let me sort of continue this story as a bridge from what I just said to beginning the Alexander Technique. When I was a gymnast, I had this remarkable experience. I was studying in the summers with Danny Millman, who wrote The Peaceful Warrior. But at the time, he was just a great gymnastic coach. And he was teaching me about how to tumble and how to long horse vault. And one day outside, I had a great day of tumbling, and I was doing these front somersaults, and I did a movement where I went up so high, and it was as if I stopped at the top of the somersault, like at the fulcrum of the zenith of that somersault, and it was like everything stopped, and I was as light as could be, and I just wondered what that was. It was such a great feeling, and it was so effortless, and I started to become interested in this moving without effort, this idea of moving without effort. I guess because I was so hyper. I used so much effort as a child, so much excessive effort. And here I had this experience of effortlessness. And that became something I got interested in. So at a certain point, I started reading Aldous Huxley, and I stumbled into his relationship with Alexander. And I read Zen and the Art of Archery. And I started to find disciplines that acknowledged this value of effortlessness, of how to do things without effort. And this idea of non-doing, actually, this in Taoism it's called Wu Wei. So this idea of effortless effort or harmonious activity, however you might translate it. So that was part of what took me into Alexander Technique. And another part of it was at a certain point, I transitioned from being a gymnast to being a modern dancer. And I had a dance teacher that said to me that I had some really strong gymnastic habits, and that to be a dancer, a modern dancer, I was going to have to unlearn them. And she felt that Alexander work would be something that might help me do that. She said, you're going to learn how to dance very quickly, but you have to unlearn certain patterns. So her mentioning that, and then my reading about that came together. And then at some point I said, I have to find an Alexander teacher. And that's how I came to it.
So if someone, you're at a party, or not around movement people, someone said, what is an Alexander teacher, or what is the Alexander technique? What would be your quick response?
Well, I would say, do you want a one-sentence answer? Do you want a paragraph? Or do you want 12-hour workshop?
Well, I think we're in the podcast format, so let's start with the one sentence and then build from there.
The one sentence would be, it teaches you how to redirect unnecessary tension into useful energy. That would be my one sentence.
Great. Now let's expand on that. So what happens in an Alexander lesson? Sometimes it's in groups. Usually it's one-to-one, isn't it? I've had a bunch of lessons. What happens in that lesson?
Well, I teach primarily in groups. But I also enjoy individual lessons, but I often teach in groups. And what happens? That's not easy to answer. I usually start a workshop with a theme or with an image or a story. Like if I give you an example, sometimes I talk about being at a rodeo and watching a certain event called bulldogging. And that's when a cowboy and a bull come out into a ring together, and the cowboy is on a horse, has to lean over and get the horns of the bull and bring the bull down to the ground. And so I might be telling a group this kind of story, and I'll go on and explain how the cowboy has to pull the steer's head back and put pressure down the spine of the animal so it stops breathing, so its front legs buckle, so its pelvis tucks under, so its back haunches are weak, and then it can bring the animal down. And I'll try to get people to see what interferes with a person's physical power and what good physical power looks like. So, for example, if the cowboy doesn't succeed in getting the bull down, if the bull resists what the cowboy is doing, you'll see the bull make a certain movement with its head, and its spine will decompress, and will take in tremendous amount of air, and its tail will stick up in the air, and its back haunches are really powerful. And I try to get people to understand that we have patterns, we have ways in which we disintegrate our bodies, the way we have patterns in which we break our bodies down so they don't work very well. And then we have inherent patterns that integrate us. And Alexander work is a lot about becoming aware of how we're not functioning well, how we're interfering with our natural integration. And then it's a process where you learn how to bring that natural integration back and get it working for you. So there's all kinds of ways that's a very physical way into the technique. And then sometimes I'll take a more psychological approach into the work. Sometimes I'll approach it actually aesthetically, and I'll start showing people sculpture from Michelangelo or from Da Vinci or something. And so there's lots of ways into introducing people to the work. At some point, once I get a sense of people understand what I'm teaching, I start to use my hands, of course, to to trigger this integration pattern in people. And that creates a very strong experience in most people. And then they start physically understanding what the work's about, not just intellectually.
Yeah.
They start
Okay.
to feel.
Let me jump in there, Bruce, if I may. So I'll give my sort of crude understanding of it because I feel like it might help listeners. You seem like you come in quite a sophisticated level. You can add to what I'm saying or correct it. So I think the first thing for me that's interesting about Alexander lessons is they're called lessons, right? So it's educational. It's not kind of corrective. And my experience of Alexander technique, the little I've had, is that someone is helping me become aware of my patterns of use. So it might be how I sit or stand or play a musical instrument or talk or whatever I'm doing. They're helping me become aware of how I'm doing something so I can do it in a way which is more easeful, more effective, taking out some of that parasitic movement, some of the tension that doesn't need to be there. And either through, group lesson or sometimes like putting hands on, doing very gentle movement work. And the focus is often on the kind of head and neck relationship, right? Like it reminded me of what you were saying with the bull there's a couple of Aikido throws where if you control someone's head, then the body follows because, once it kind of has to. And there's a couple of very effective Aikido throws where you just take someone's head and you move their head and then the whole system has to follow. So that's my very simplistic understanding of it. Is that more or less
very good? It's a very good definition. Another one sentence definition would be Alexander work is about you learn to be aware of how you're doing what you're doing as you're doing it.
Yeah.
And with the goal of exactly what you were saying, of becoming aware of how you're using unnecessary effort or force, and how to redirect, how to make use of your force and your effort in a way that works for you and not against you. And that's the first level of Alexander work.
Yeah.
On the most basic level, you could say it's about movement, efficiency, and effectiveness. But that's really actually not at the heart of what the work is about, but it's almost a perk.
Okay.
It's almost something that comes along, that happens as you study the work, but the essence of the work is actually not about that. So okay. If you're interested, I should try to get that across.
Yeah. So I mean, because I've definitely, I've seen musicians use it to improve their musical performance. Obviously, the founder was a speaker, used to do performances. I know it's big in acting schools, for example, tends to be quite big in the arts. And then people come in maybe with neck pain or back pain as the sort of physical stuff, but you seem to be pointing to something else. So what is the main point of it then?
So the main point really is that our situation is that we are people that we respond to stimuli. We respond to the world inside of us and around us. So, and the question is, how are we responding to what's going on around us and inside of us? And that determines how we use our body and how we move. So, for instance, and I do this in a workshop too, like if in Japan, for instance, where I am, if I go to take the subway at 8:30 in the morning, the train, it's really crowded. There's a lot of people. And most people will go into that train and it's so crowded that everyone gets tense in their body. Everyone's like this in their body. It's just completely packed.
Yeah, I was in one a few days ago in London that was similar.
Yeah. So people are reacting to, their bodies are reacting to that particular stimuli. And then in Alexander work, what you realize is that all those people and that situation is actually not making you tense. That the only thing that's making us tense is us.
Yeah, this is a really strong point, isn't it? Like, for example, if a piece of music comes on and you hate it and I love it, you'll get tense and I won't. So logically, it simply cannot be the piece of music that's making you tense.
Exactly.
Right? Logical.
So it is. So you're in that situation. And then if you realize that, oh, I'm the only person who is making myself tense and no one in this train is making me tense, then to the degree that I can make myself, to the degree that I'm capable of relaxing, I can let go of that tension. So then the next day, I could decide to go onto that train. And before I get on that train, I could decide that no matter what happens, I'm not going to tense my body up. And then I can walk onto that train and choose to respond to that whole situation differently. And so the essence of Alexander work is really to take control of how we respond to everything around us and in us. And when I say in us, it could be a disturbing thought that we're having.
Yeah.
And then we react to that thought. And it's a study in, how did I just react to that? And is that useful? And is that helping me? And can I choose to respond in a different way? The guy that says it most succinctly is Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. He has this insight. He's in a concentration camp. He was in 3 of them. And he realizes one moment, he says, the one thing that no one can take away from me is how I choose to react to what they do to me.
Yeah.
And at that moment, the guy was free.
Yeah.
He knew that that's the one thing they could never take away from him. And he found his dignity as a person in that moment. And that's really, in essence, what Alexander work is about. So when, over the years, when you learn you wake up enough so you can choose to respond to things the way you want to, what the result is that your body gets freer and freer.
Yeah.
And you move more and more easily because less things are disturbing you.
Yeah. Okay? So if I'm going to jump in again, it seems like primarily what you teach is around freedom. And, there's this interesting paradox. And I think Viktor Frankl's, his little book, I highly recommend to all the listeners. It's really easy, quick read, but very deep. That, he's in perhaps the worst circumstances I can imagine, one of the worst circumstances that has existed in modern times, and yet still says, I can choose how I react. Now, it doesn't mean that he can, he might get shot if he does certain things, but he could, for example, he talks about a guard and having some compassion, and the guard having split up with his girlfriend and him having some, different response to that, even if it's just internally. And what this opens up for me is, on the one hand, is a personal responsibility. Like, no one else is making you tense, and that's quite challenging to people, And I think
that's why.
Simultaneously, I feel like you need to say simultaneously, and there are conditions. A concentration camp isn't the same as a beach in Hawaii. There are conditions that we're in, though ultimately, if we want to be free, it's about saying, I have a choice even there. And for me, the somatic work, the embodied work, gives us a method. Because to just say to someone, be more relaxed, is like, well, how does that help? Or, having the intention as you get on the train is helpful, but you've got more than the intention, right? You've also got a huge level of body awareness and a set of skills, and there's a practice you have which enables you to inhibit, I think is the word they use, isn't it? That fight flight response from kicking in.
Yes. Yes, there's a somatic component where it's helpful if you have a fair amount of body awareness. It's not essential. Like, there are people who, when you look at someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, and the civil rights movement's a great example, or Gandhi's movement too, where people had to learn how to not respond, to not react violently to violence, even if they were being hit or spit at or cursed at.
And they had training camps for that. They actually had training camps to help people with that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So these are people that, it might have helped them if Alexander work was part of their training, if they had, but even if they didn't have that, it's still possible to use your mind in such a way where you take charge of how you want to respond. And if you have physical training, it's an advantage.
Yeah.
Because you feel what you're doing very quickly, and then you can choose not to do it.
Can speed that learning curve up. And I wonder if it is just about the mind, or if they're not intuitively realizing that as their body gets tense, they're becoming angry or whatever, and they're kind of not just intuitively, because that's something I feel like even by the time we're sort of 5 years old, people have a little bit of skill with, but it can be massively sort of sped up by having a body awareness practice. And, you know, like Paul Linden, one of my teachers, teaches people just to relax their belly, for example. And immediately, you know, there's a kind of strong kind of inhibition of the fight-flight response from that, because when you're scared or angry, you have a tense belly, and that can just massively speed up people's learning curves to be told that.
Yes, it's true. So it's a tool that can help. But you know, when you reach this level of studying Alexander work, when it becomes not so much about movement in and of itself, when it really becomes, you know, how do I relate to everything within myself and around me? How do I choose to respond and be? See, it's not about how we're doing what we're doing. It's about how we're being when we do what we're doing. It's about how we're being when we do what we're doing. So the work, it's ironic. It starts out being about moving well and this, but it doesn't end there. It ends up being about how you're being as a person, and that influences how you do what you do. Yeah.
So the reason I would, in my sort of earlier embodied training years, wasn't too attracted to things like Alexander Technique and also Feldenkrais, that, they're about awareness and movement, is that they didn't seem to sort of strongly emphasize the sort of psychological or the social or the emotional side. And it seems like you've brought a lot more of that in. Like I went to one of your workshops, really enjoyed it, that this emphasis on how you're being as a person, not just can you stand, you know, because some of my Alexander Technique teachers I know are a little bit obsessed with sort of poise and posture. And I'm like, okay, but how is that actually helping your life? You know, it seemed to me like you're very much interested in the kind of being or the human component of it, and not just, let's sit in a nice way or even play an instrument better.
Yes, it's true. When I work with a musician, I tell them, I say, you know, I know you love music and you're interested in your music, but I'm not. I mean, I love music too, but I'm not your music teacher. I'm not interested in your music. I don't care if it gets better or worse. I want you to get better. I'm interested in what happens in you. I'm interested in the quality of your experience as a person when you play music, you know, and so I'm not interested in content. I'm interested in how that person is relating and experiencing what they're doing. You know, are they open to it? Are they beating themselves up? Are they killing themselves doing this? Are they enjoying it? Are they free when they're doing it? Are they, you know?
Let's involve the listeners, Bruce, because I feel like a podcast is a weird format where two people are chatting and there's kind of all these people in the background in the future listening. Like, so, you know, people might be listening to this. They might be on the subway in Berlin. They might be walking down the street in Austin, Texas. You know, they're all over the world. Like, some of those questions just seem like some really good inquiries. Like, obviously, we don't know what they're doing, right? So we don't know the content as they listen to this. They could be doing washing up in the kitchen, you know? Mm-hmm. I listen to podcasts when I'm washing up sometimes. And, you know, those questions of like, you know, is there ease now? Or what were the questions you just said? Like, I'd love to kind of get them involved, you know?
Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
So how can we involve the people who are listening? Like, for example, to notice if you're using more effort than necessary. Like sometimes I'm washing up and I notice I'm like hitting the plates and I'm like, you can really touch plates gently. In fact, it's probably quite advisable to, you know, it's like, it's not necessary to use muscle when I'm washing a plate, right? Like, so that's a really good question for me at any time is, am I doing more than necessary?
Yeah, that's right. There are lots of ways into that. Like a big part of Alexander work is what he called sensory appreciation. So I like sensory consciousness actually, but you know, you're doing the dishes, and if you if you decide, well, okay, I'm going to listen to the water. It's like movement, sound, and touch are intricately connected usually. Like if you're doing the dishes, you'll hear something, right? You're moving, you'll hear something, and you're touching. And if you start to just notice those three things, a lot happens. And what's usually happening is we want to get the dishes done. So we're not attending to the action moment by moment. We're in the future somewhere saying, okay, I'm almost finished these dishes. I'm going to wipe the sink down.
Right?
We're just getting it done.
Yeah.
But if you start to bring in your senses, and especially this trinity of sound, movement, touch, then like right now, like for example, I'm sitting on this chair. So I'm touching the chair's touching me. I'm speaking, so I hear something, but I feel a lot going on inside my mouth because my tongue is touching my teeth, and my upper lip is touching my lower lip, and so and then I'm moving. I'm moving my head a little bit, my mouth is moving. So there's information coming in through these three senses, and that's very helpful to put you in the moment of when you're doing what you're doing. So sensory feedback is a really important part of the technique.
Mm-hmm.
Important part of the work.
So it is kind of a mindfulness-based practice, like, okay, noticing which part of me, which side of me is heavier on the seat. The sound one's a great one, isn't it? Like we tend not to think of something as making sound. Like you can meditate on the sound of the breath, not just the feeling of the breath. Or my wife's very quiet, and it's quite disconcerting because I've only lived with people that made a lot of noise when they walked around. She's a bit of a ninja, and like you can hear the mood someone's in by how they wash up. It's like bang, 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 or you can hear that by how they, slam the door slightly, and even not a big slam, but my experience, I can get quite tuned in to those subtle differences in noise.
Listen to someone walking up the steps, and if you don't see them, you can get a sense of male, female, heavy, light, child, old person, tired,
emotional. I teach this with life coaches. I say like, okay, here's 3 knocks on the door, and one is like, and one is like, and the next, and then they go, okay, you're immediately getting an impression of that client, and you haven't even seen them yet, right?
Yes. And in that action, you can just see sound, movement, touch. See, they're all happening exactly at the same time. Sound, movement, touch. So that's this sensory. Mindfulness is a word I have some reservation about. I know it's really popular, and I know what people mean by it, or I think I do anyway, but I tend not to use it because I really think what we're talking about is more what I would call sensory consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think what we tend to do is we associate consciousness with the mind and sensing with the body.
Yeah, it's also not necessarily a good translation of the Pali. So the word sati is the Pali for mindfulness. And mindfulness is a pretty loose translation because the word mind is completely different in Pali. So it's a very anglicized translation. So the original word could be translated as remembrance, like remembering to come back to the reality. Or even heartfulness, I've heard it called. So it's not really, the mind is stressed mostly in the translation. That can make it sound very cognitive, can't it?
Well, for whatever that is that's happening, that people call mindfulness, it is such a big experience that it's hard to find a word for it.
Yeah.
It really is. So, but I think it involves this integration of consciousness and sensorial life. And so you could say mindfulness is coming to your senses.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book called Coming to the Senses on mindfulness. There's literally a book with that name. Let's come back to end gaining, because I'm a terror for this. I'm an ADHD kid still. and I'm one step ahead of things. And, often my life's just very busy. I feel like most of my clients are exactly the same. And it's like, right, what's the next thing I've got to do that can, or I'm doing something. It's like, I just want to get it finished. And I see this with Aikido techniques. People will be trying to do the throw before they've done the balance taking, or, the thing that sets up the throw. Yeah. And as I understand it in Alexander technique, that's called end gaining. Is that the correct term?
Yeah. That just means that the goal, when the goal becomes more important than the process of getting there.
And the irony, of course, is often the goal becomes less effective if you're not involved in the process. Like, if you're not involved in the process of a throw, you're just trying to throw something, it's going to be very crude. If I'm...
It's not what you wanted.
Yeah, like in a conversation, if I'm trying to hard sell someone, or I'm on a date and I'm getting pushy, or do you know what I mean? It's like the process is the thing to pay attention to, even if you just wanted the outcome.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a big part of the work, because then when you think about that, like, let's say an example would be if you're in line at a store and you're afraid you're going to be late and you want to be somewhere already, which is in the future, you're not there yet, then I call it an out-of-body experience. It's like your mind is in the future and your body can't be in the future. And then if you notice what's happening in your body in those situations, you'll be very, very tense.
Yeah, and you won't notice what's happening in your body. That's the thing, right? Until you
notice what's going on around you or in your body. Exactly.
You're absent to your life. You're not responding appropriately to what's around you, whether it's a good conversation or a kiss or whatever, because it's like you can't respond appropriately because you're not there to notice and to listen.
Yeah.
Actually,
and it won't get you there any faster. I mean, it won't help in any way.
Sorry to jump in. Great example, when an aeroplane lands, and most countries, maybe not Japan, but most countries, people jump up and they don't want to be on that plane.
Yes.
Like this, and they're not getting out any quicker, and everyone's tense, and then everyone's feeding off each other's tension. And
that's a good example.
It's like pure end gaining. I see that has happened. I've been flying for 20 years now, and in some countries it happens more than others. Like Israel and Russia, it happens way more than the Swiss, for example. But it's got worse.
You're right. It doesn't happen in Japan.
Right, I didn't think so. So maybe we can talk about culture, because people can't see it listening to this on the podcast, but you're joining me from a tatami, which is a kind of rice straw mat room with screen doors. You're in Japan right now. You spend a third of your life in New Mexico, right? A third in Japan, and a third traveling around the world, like in Germany and all sorts of other places. So let's talk about the cross-cultural body. That's a bit of a running theme on this podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I when I teach, I talk about how people have different kinds of bodies. Like Eckhart Tolle has a great concept called a pain body. And, in psychology, when people want to talk about different psychic forces inside of a person, they have words for it. Like they'll say, the ego, or the superego, or the id.
Or just part of me wants this, part of me doesn't.
Yeah. The parent, the adult, the child, the top dog, the underdog, but the same is true for bodies. I have found that people don't just have one body. And I'll give you an example. Like there's what I would call your mammal body,
right?
Which just, just your biological body. A mammal, we're mammals.
Yeah.
So that's one body. And people are not that in touch with that body very often.
So that's like the sort of the dog in me when someone brings food across a restaurant. I'm like, is it my food? I want the food. That kind of dog-like primitive part. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a cultural body, people's bodies are influenced and sculpted in part by the culture they are raised in. And so Japanese has a rather distinctive cultural body. It's always dangerous to generalize because you're going to get exceptions, but having taught in Japan for 25 years, there are distinct patterns that are here that are not often, that you don't find so often in other countries.
Yep.
And that's true of all countries. Another people have gender bodies.
Yep.
So people learn how to move like a woman or how to move like a man. You know, the difference in movement between a male red-bone coonhound and a female red-bone coonhound is not as different as it is for Homo sapiens.
Yeah. I mean, I can still tell a cat if it's male or female pretty much 90% of the time. But I mean, with a human, you can tell before you can see their face. Like you can, if someone's 2 miles away, you can just see them right at the end of the street. This sense of, and I know, you know, for trans people, this can be a real challenge. And, you know, there's people that are transition. It's a skill. You know, there's a real, and you look at people that do this well, like there's the Thai Ladyboy show that comes to Brighton regularly. Like these people have real skill in order to be able to pull that off, as it were. Now, I don't want to be offensive to anyone here. Excuse me if I'm using terms that aren't cool anymore, but it's like I'm actually crediting the difficulty that it can take to just through movement pattern to not immediately be recognized as a certain gender. And I'm definitely with you on the cultural bodies. I'm going to Japan for the first time this summer, but I've been around Japanese people for 20 years, and it's very easy for me to tell there's a particular embodiment. And yeah, there's individuals. And of course, you know, I'm not the same as my personal embodiment is quite different from a British cultural embodiment. The British tends to be quite polite and reserved, and I tend not to be. But it's both are there. There is a British body. I almost feel like in yoga they talk about sheaths, koshas that are, you know, different koshas that are existing. And that's the model we generally use when embodiment is sort of saying, look, it's like concentric circles. There's a part that's universal, like fight or flight. That's the same. You know, I've done that in 30 countries. We work with fight or flight. It's the same. And then there's the cultural body, and then there's the individual body, and then there's the situational body, right? Like I'm in a particular relationship with you.
There's one that's extremely important that I actually spend a fair amount of time on, which I call the cosmetic body. And this is important because that's where people tend to put their attention. And the way I talk about that is like, for instance, think about, if we just start, let's say, on the layer of clothes.
Yeah.
Think about how much time and energy a lot of people put to how their clothes look. And it's not their body yet. And then you have makeup, and makeup is also, you know, all this stuff. Clothes are fine, makeup's fine, but it's not it's still cosmetic. And then you have, like, you get to hair. Some of us have hair. Well, hair is functional. You know, hair is part of our body, but the way we look at it, you know, we'll spend a lot of money on all these things. And skin is part of the body, but you see, we look at it cosmetically, and we spend money on it cosmetically. So, and then even like large muscle groups, right? So then large muscle groups, even though that's really a real part of our body, people view it, they're looking at their bodies cosmetically. And then when you have this cosmetic relationship with your body, it becomes objectified, and you don't end up with a really deep subjective love for your biological existence, you know, for your real biological body.
Well, the body becomes a means to a social end at that point, isn't it? And I mean, as soon as you pull out a camera, posturally, a lot of it's cosmetic. So you pull out a camera in a training, people will change their posture because they go, you walk into a room and someone sits up a bit straighter, or tries to be relaxed.
So when I teach Alexander work, early on I have to get people to understand. I said, you know, this work has nothing to do with what you look like.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely nothing to do with what you look like. As a result, you may like move more beautifully, or person may find you more attractive, but it's just not what the work is about. You know, the work is about the quality of your experience, and it's just not cosmetic.
Paul Linden, my main mentor, is very like this as well. Talks about, you know, letting the belly hang loose can be really good for you. He doesn't care what it looks like. And I used to tell my students this, and, you know, don't objectify yourself. It's really about the experience of it. even though there may be some other benefit in that domain. And I was working with some Russian women. I work in Russia quite a lot. And they just went, yeah, fuck you. They just went, no, that's not acceptable to us. And what they came up with was fascinating. Some students of mine there, they do fashion and style, more to the point, in a way to help their embodiment. So this is a little bit different from what you're saying, which generally was my point of view. Till they said, look, this is aesthetics is really important to us. You know, they would never turn up to a podcast in a slightly dirty sweater like I have. And they said, you know, why don't we work with this? So they started to say, like, if I'm in certain clothes, it brings out a certain felt sense. And they're actually, and it's the first time I'd come across that, because previously I just said, you know what, doesn't matter. It's not what I teach. It's not what I do. And then I realized you could actually work with that sort of those external things in a way which was a little bit more internal. So I just want to add that in.
Yes, and also, you know, when you're a teacher, you have to work with where your student is at.
Yeah.
And it's not so much like you're trying to convert a person to how you view the world. It's like if that's if that's what they value and that's where they're at, well, then the question is, how can I join them?
Yeah.
And connect to what they care about and get the work through.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So
would you have a limit with that? I mean, if someone said to you, hey, I want to get better at mugging people, can you give me an Alexander lesson to make me more efficient mugger? Would you go for that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I can give you two experiences. One, when I was teaching in theater departments at one of them was Rutgers University, and a young acting student who was about 18, he said, I want to work on smoking, because sometimes I have a scene and I have to smoke, or sometimes I like a cigarette, and you know, he's being a kid, and I said, sure, just light up a cigarette and I'll see what you do when you smoke. So he does, you know, and he looks very cool, of course, and he blows a ring and something, and great. And I said, now I'm just going to work with you. And so I use my hands and I get him really opened in his body. And I say, okay, go ahead, just take a puff. And he inhales and exhales. And I said, well, how was that? And he said, oh my God, I could really feel that smoke come into my lungs. I said, terrific. And that was it. I never said, you know, you should smoke, you shouldn't smoke, it's bad for you. My teacher used to say, our job is to help people become sensitive.
Yeah.
And what they do with their sensitivity is really their own business. You know? However, I must say, I once had a kid, he was an acting student. He was in ROTC. He was in a military, you know, kind of officer training, and they go to college. And he had to work on kind of crawling on his arms, you know, and knee, you know, going under something really low with a rifle, you know. And at the time, you know, this is back, you know, I'm still kind of a hippie, definite nonviolent. I'm still a nonviolent person philosophically, and I said, you know, I just don't know if I can do this one, and I didn't.
All right. Yeah, I think there are definitely some lines people can draw, and maybe that this has been a big debate in the mindfulness community, because it's like, you know, I was part of the early kind of wave of people teaching mindfulness in big business, and I saw some real benefits to that, like really humanizing kind of heartfelt things, but also I saw some ways in which that could be misused. And, you know, there's mindfulness for snipers. Mindfulness is used quite strongly in the pickup community now. You know, so and I feel like embodiment has got the same ethical dilemmas, essentially. Like where do we use this? Is this going to be misused? Is this fundamentally against my values? Or, you know, I was with a management group a few days ago, and it was just like, look, it's not my job to tell you what to do. It's my job to help you be aware of what you're doing, help you build some range, and then make some more choices. And
so it's really a very personal choice, but it brings up a great question. Like Alexander once said, if you bring me a saint, I'll make him a better saint. And if you bring me a thief, I'll make him a better thief.
Right.
And in a way, what he was saying is that I can get you to use yourself really well, but whether you make good use of your good use is up to you.
Yeah.
You know,
I think
of how you're going to make use of being conscious and balanced and poised and ready, and is what you're going to do with that is
I think that's certainly one way of looking at it, and the other way is that there is an embodied ethics, and this is Paul Linden stuff again, that as someone gets more sensitive, they go, okay, wow, this actually really hurts me or others, right? The empathy comes back on. And I've seen business people have that empathy suddenly come back online, and they've just had a look of shock, like, oh my God, I'm brutalizing myself, or maybe their secretary or whoever else too, like, and I have that on a daily basis sometimes. I just slow down, stop being busy, I'll come back to the moment, stop end gaining, and I'll be like, what am I doing? This is not in keeping with my values. It might be just like I'm working too hard or not spending time with my partner or whatever. And it's like, wow, just that kind of coming back to the ethical and the values implicit in the body, So I feel like, the thing about making a better thing.
That's a great question. And whether as we become sensitive, will we gravitate to becoming, like, if we become more sensitive physically, and if there's a connection between our life emotionally and physically, will that create more empathy?
Yeah.
And so does that happen? And, I've seen it happen and I've seen it not happen.
I've seen it not happen when people have mostly been paying attention to the sort of muscular body, like athletes, maybe yoga teachers doing a strong yoga practice. But in that case, it's almost possible that it actually makes it worse, because all of a sudden the main signals they're receiving are kind of large muscular kind of structural signals. My hamstrings ache or whatever. And I'm not so much the sort of sensitive feeling into the general kind of visceral body.
Yeah.
It's an open one.
It's a great subject.
And can you talk a little bit more about Japan? I'm interested, because I'm going to be going there this year, but also because it's pretty different. Like, it was one of 3 countries in the world that wasn't colonized. So basically every country in the world is European to some degree, with the exception of Ethiopia, Thailand, and Japan. So it's like it was cut off for a long time. So it had a long period of history to develop its own kind of cultural embodiment, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are some of the things that jump out for you as particularly Japanese embodiment?
I think the strongest thing is that there's terrific collective consciousness here, where people are aware of the group.
Yep.
People are aware of other people around them, and it changes the body. It's not as, consciousness doesn't start with their body and then radiate out. It starts with a big environment and then moves in. So I'll give you an example. So, like, if you picture like these beautiful Chinese landscape paintings like Song Dynasty, and there's big mountains and clouds, and there's a vast landscape, and then you see a tiny little person walking up a mountain, or a tiny little, it's even built into the language. If I want to say to you, I'm sitting in my kitchen eating dinner in Osaka, right? In Japan, you'd say Osaka, kitchen, eating,
As I understand it, with Japanese,
and you wouldn't even use the word I. You wouldn't use the word I at all.
Yeah.
So it starts big, and then it goes to small. And this is a kind of consciousness here, where people take in the environment first, and they're hardly there, basically. They're the last thing that they become aware of, in a way.
I've definitely seen with Japanese Aikido friends, which I've been around quite a lot, like that sort of social consideration. And in Britain, we had this, not to the Japanese degree, but to some degree. And it's got less as we've become more kind of individualized, and places I spend time like Israel and the States, maybe the opposite end of that spectrum. Britain's towards the Japanese side a little bit traditionally, though that's changed. And I think somewhat sad about that sometimes. There isn't always that social consideration. And linguistically as well, another one I've heard of, tell me if I'm wrong, the verb's often right at the end. So you have to be quite patient to understand what's happening, which encourages a listening, I would say, right?
It does, because, and that's another thing, you Japanese people tend not to interrupt you when you speak because they don't know what you mean until you get to the end of the sentence. So you could say a whole sentence and it could end up with not at the very end. And that also changes, it just changes the physical, both of these things, the spatial awareness, the awareness of the group, and needing to wait to the end in speech.
There's a certain containment to the body, isn't there?
Yeah.
A care and the containment. That's what and the British have a little bit of that. Like, I have an Irish family and they have much less containment than the English. You know,
Yes.
It's kind of like, the Irish is more to the sides, you know, and the British is like squashed from the sides slightly. It's like,
I think of course, there's an advantage and disadvantage to everything, it seems, and so it's wonderful being an American living in Japan. It helps for me. Being raised an American and being influenced by Japan creates, I feel, a healthy balance between awareness of other people and awareness of myself. And I think for Japanese people, it's also often really great to go to a country like America. And
my Japanese friends felt really free when they were at university in England. They were like, they just felt the freedom.
So when I'm in America, I live like a Japanese person. When I'm in Japan, I live a little bit like an American person.
Uh-huh.
It just works out just right. So it's great if you can find your complementary culture.
Yes, that's a nice way of looking at it. Complementary cultures. Like for me, like, for example, living in Brazil, I learned to kind of be a bit more passionate and kind of override some of that English stifledness.
Yeah, exactly.
It was like, wow, that really goes well with the British kind of slightly considered, reserved, and that Brazilian slightly more party, out there kind of vibe. And I thought, okay, that is some balance in that. Or, I often say, like, had I not lived in America, I would never put my business out there in the way that I do. Exactly. Make a podcast like this. It's audacious, to the average British person might not want to do that. But that's what I stole from America. So every country I'm in, I'm like, what can I steal? And it's usually what I do is I live in a foreign country, or visit a foreign country, and I have a bit of a love affair for a bit. I'm in a honeymoon period where I think they're amazing. I'm like, oh my God, you should all be Russian. They're the best people ever. And then I get really resentful and I'm kind of like, I hate these people because they're the downside. And then there's some sort of healthy integration. Maybe that's just my fucked up way of doing it. But Bruce, can you talk a little bit?
I'm similar.
Sorry, there's a bit of a gap on the timeline. So can you talk a little bit about touch before we wrap up? Because, you were our mutual friend, my political sparring partner and good friend,
Sure.
John Coote, introduced us originally. And he introduced you to me as sort of a touch expert. And, I've felt your touch, and you certainly have a very, very developed sense of touch in some of the adjustments you do. And there's very few embodiment teachers in the world, actually, that I would put in that category. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about touch.
Yes. Well, it's hard to believe, but, because I'm 66, but I have been almost 67, and I have been using my hands to help people move well since I was 11 years old. So I have been using my hands for 55 years, just in so many situations, swimming, diving, gymnastics, pas de deux classes, tight push hands, Aikido, tango, it's just so much contact, Alexander work primarily, so much contact with people. I tried to figure out how many people. I've had 15,000 people under my hands.
Wow.
In my lifetime, something like that. And
party.
But it's more than, just the sheer number of hours. It's I think, because, I'm looking back at a lot of years now, I think it's a gift. I think like some people are born with a musical intelligence. Yeah. I think I actually was born with a very high tactile intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I see my hands see what I touch, and my eyes touch what I see.
That's a primary sense for you. Like,
it's a primary. Actually, it's my primary sense. I live like a blind person that just happens to be able to see.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a primary sense. in a way, it's the sense that we all believe most. You know, like if you look at something, you're not sure if it's real, you go to touch it, right? Like it is, in a way, for all of us, it's the one that we trust most, and it's the only sense we can't live without as well. You know, like we die without any sense of touch, where we
That's
can
right.
die or death,
That's right.
rough, but you know, we can still survive. And you know, this idea of sort of, when it's a primary sense, it's like sometimes I look at a person in a training, and you know, in corporate trainings, like I can't touch people; it's just not cool, you know, in that environment. But what I can do is I look at them, and it's like I'm touching them. You know, it's like, oh, you're tense in your back, you know, and it's in a way in which almost a synesthesia between the visual sense when you've, you know, I was traveling around the world doing Aikido for many years. So I was just, unlike most Aikidoists, I was just touching a lot of bodies, because normally there's maybe 10 people in your club and you just, those 10 bodies, but I was training in different places every week. And I was just around for a number of years, just around a lot of bodies. I was also very promiscuous at the time. So that was another lot of bodies. And it was after a while, you didn't even have to touch them. I could just look at an Aikido partner and go, okay, I can unbalance you backwards, or this muscle's going to be tense, so I'm not going to try that arm lock. And so it was touching through the eyes, as it were.
The interesting thing about touch is you can touch a person's body. I tell my students I never touch a person's body.
Yeah.
I only touch a person. And I think the thing that distinguishes me for a lot of people inside the Alexander world is I don't have a particularly light touch. Sometimes I touch lightly, but my touch is really not light. It's not tense. There isn't effort in it, but it's penetrating. And I seem to touch people on a deeper, very often on a very deep level. And I don't really even know how or why that happens, but when I work with my hands, people often feel like I am touching them, like their being and not their body.
Yeah, it's subtle, but
I think something, I don't know if it's teachable, but people make very deep, strong change when they feel that kind of contact, especially if it's a knowing contact, like you, through that touch, you know how to bring that person into better balance. They don't feel like you're just changing their body. They feel like I'm becoming a different person.
Yeah, I had the experience of when you did some, you know, adjustments on me, which was still relatively subtle, little changes to weight and relaxation in my legs. I think you're working on it. It was like, oh, all of a sudden the room looked different. It was a really good demo of embodiment, because when an embodiment shifts as opposed to just the body, it's like all of a sudden the perception is different, and the emotion is different, and the cognition is different. Like all the aspects of being change through the body when you're working as an embodied adjustment, rather than just, you know, someone could massage my foot and the world would look different even if I was standing different, you know? So for me, it was a great demo of that. And I saw lots of people
that's really
say that again. It's really,
that's what I'm interested in. That's my interest. It's changes on that level. I'm interested in contacting the being through the body. The body's interesting. It's beautiful. It really is, but it's not my prime concern.
That's why I was interested in your work, and almost no other Alexander technique teacher, if I'm honest. You know, there's that added depth to it, which I really appreciate. And maybe as a little experiment we can offer anyone in there, you know, it's like find a willing, you know, anyone listening as a way into this, because it could sound very abstract, is, you know, find a willing partner. And, you know, how is it to touch the body rather than the person? Because even though I think you may have a very sophisticated level of this, my experience is that students can at least begin to grasp it quite intuitively and quite quickly. And some people are always, just without any training, are always touching you and not your arm, whereas other people really do need to be trained out of that objectified. You know, I have some students, particularly yoga students, like, you know, they just hoik people around like they were shopping carts, and I'm like, stop it, please, that's a human being, you know. And it's like, even people with a lot of body training can miss that, you know, and it's embarrassing when they realize, they're like, shit, you know, I've been doing this for years. But people with no training can intuitively get it. But I just feel like if we're all in that
actually it's very natural. Like if a person if you have a close friend and they're disheartened about something, and you put your arm around their shoulder, you know, it's like, this stuff is really natural. And then when you learn to be an Alexander teacher technically, and you're working on this technique, sometimes you lose the stuff that's so basic and natural, and so how you get that back in there is interesting. But I want to say, and I define myself very much as an Alexander teacher, and very proudly, because I love Alexander's work. I love his thinking, and I feel, from having been in that community for a long time, that there are really many Alexander teachers that work very deeply and don't just work on a person's body. And but like any profession, there's going to be a certain number of people who are really wonderful, and probably a large group that are quite good, and some that are so, and some that are not good, But my experience is that I have run into a lot of very profound Alexander teachers. So I feel
ones in Brighton.
I don't think it's an easy thing to teach.
No,
I think it's a very humbling task.
I had lessons for a while, for good reasons. Some good teachers in Brighton, a guy called Mark, a woman called Bee, some good teachers locally for those that listen in Brighton. I could recommend, and I don't want to be too hard on it. I'm sort of hard on every embodied practice, because I see that they all have their blind spots and their strengths as well. And certainly the training is very thorough for Alexander technique. It's a solid training. It's not a kind of month in Goa to do yoga. It's a really, and I think like this trap of technique is very interesting, isn't it? That whenever we learn a form, to learn the form, by definition, we have to learn to look at things objectively. And then we risk that, if I pick up a baby, I don't pick up a hunk of meat that has a baby in it. I pick up a baby, it's the person, that's the most natural thing. And then returning to that. And same with Aikido, if people are throwing me and they're throwing me just as a thing, it feels quite different than if I'm aware that I'm a person. And I did my 30th birthday, I did a world record of 3,001 Aikido rolls with my friend Polish Pete. And after sort of 6 hours of being thrown nonstop, the only people I wanted to touch me were the people who were throwing me as a person, because it was just so disgusting and obnoxious after 6 hours of, and it was about 50% of the group, and I got really picky as to who I'd let throw me, because I was just at a point of exhaustion, and, there's this kind of abrasiveness will happen with an objectified point of view, and it happens conversationally, it happens emotionally. Great. So some awesome stuff there, Brice. I feel like we could talk for another few hours, but we do need to wrap this up. In terms of finding out more about you, so your website is peacefulbodyschool.com, right?
Actually, just brucefertman.com.
Oh.
The easiest way to remember.
Okay.
Just Bruce Fertman.
I'll do both. So is a Peaceful Body School something else?
No, it's the same. It's the same blog. That's my blog, brucefertman.com.
Okay, got it.
Peaceful Body School.
But they're both there.
And also, I'm just putting up a new website in the next couple weeks, alexanderalliance.com or alexanderalliance.de. And that's my Germany school.
Mm-hmm.
So for those listeners who are in Europe, a good way to work with me is come visit me when I'm teaching at the school. And if you go onto my blog, you can find where and when I'm teaching. But if anyone who's listening is interested in my work, I am coming out with a book. It should be out in February, and it's called Teaching by Hand, Learning by Heart. And I really think that book captures my thinking and gives you a feeling of what it's like to work with me. So I'm excited about that.
Great. Well, thank you. There's been a slight time lag on this call. So if it sometimes feels, I think it's partly a mismatch of cultural bodies, but it's also that literally there's been a slight time lag. So if it sometimes feels like I'm interrupting you or jumping in, then it's like it's a little bit hard to follow.
That's okay.
just to let you know that's been happening. So any final, Bruce, it's been such a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. It's actually an honor and a treat to speak to you. So any final message to all our listeners about the body?
Think about everything that your body lets you be able to do. You know, if you think about your life and all the things that you were able to do, you know, in your life, or all the ways that your body served you, took care of you, and to get in touch with that, when you start to really appreciate how your body keeps you alive and what it lets you experience, that's the way into liking yourself. The first step is to really like what your body does for you, what it allows you to be able to experience, and how it keeps you alive. And I think that's taking that in on a very deep level. You develop a fondness, maybe that's the right word, a fondness for your biology. And this is what I mean about it's so much deeper than this cosmetic body. And then you actually start feeling some affection for yourself, you know, because you realize what your body is, how much it loves you, basically. It's like people don't love their bodies, but their bodies love them. The body does so much to keep you going. And so when a person can get in touch with that, that's a good beginning.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.